Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret history and little-known facts behind your favorite music, movies, TV shows, and more. We are your bastions of Beatleology, your philosophers of Fab, your John and Paul of the trivia world, but I'll let you work out who's who. My name's Jordan Runtagh.
And I'm Alex Heigl. I've always thought of myself as more of the magic Alex. Is he Greek? The scammer?
Greek. Yes,
the Greek scam artist who bilked them out of God knows how much money.
Wow, that's some impressive Beatle nerdery early on. Under 30 seconds in. Wow,
Yeah,
all right. Folks, just buckle up. This
Strap
is where we're
in,
headed.
baby.
Yes. Today, we are looking at my favorite album of all time. That's all I can say. By my favorite group of human beings. Not even my favorite band. My favorite group of human beings ever. Sorry, future children. It's the Beatles. They are responsible for every creative impulse I ever had. And I know I'm not alone in that sentiment. When I was a little boy, I saved up for a whole summer to get a cheap knockoff of Paul McCartney's Hofner violin bass, which I then attempted to learn how to play left-handed, even though I'm right-handed, just because I wanted to be more like him. And, in a way, I never grew out of that. I'd say at very least 80% of my reasons for getting into music journalism stemmed from my deep-seated desire to meet these guys in some futile attempt to figure out why their music moved me and millions in such a profound way. And, I'm immensely grateful to have had this sweet dream come true and speak to both surviving members of the Beatles. But, I'm no closer to knowing what it is about their music that makes it so precious. To me, it's the most definitive proof we have that magic is real. We're discussing their seventh studio album, Revolver, from 1966, which has just been the subject of a massive reissue overseen by the great Giles Martin, son of the Beatles producer George Martin. And I actually had the privilege of speaking to him for an article I wrote for People.com, which I'll be quoting on occasion. Heigl, I usually welcome our friendly differences of opinion, but go gentle with me on this one. I can't handle any knocks against my beloved Beatles. What are your thoughts on Revolver, or the Beatles in general?
Well, the big cliche about the Beatles is you hear them growing up and then, you hear them all over. You're just exposed to them, and then you get into them freshman year of college. That's kind of a logical path, right? Am I making that up?
I was a little different, as with most things.
No, I knew that.
But I've heard that. I've heard it's something that you kind of take for granted, and then all of a sudden,
yes,
somebody told me that about Bob Dylan once. I remember saying, when you're ready to receive Dylan, he will reveal himself to you. And I feel like maybe that's the same with the Beatles for most people.
Fucking ponderous. What boomer ass music journalist said that to you? I went to college with a buddy Dave Long, who you met at my wedding.
Oh yes.
Who
friend of the pod, Dave Long.
Friend of the pod, David Long. Huge Beatles dork. But I will say, more than the actual records, he and I would play duo sets at restaurants for pocket money, and he had the Beatles chord book. And honestly, going through that and trying to arrive at different arrangements of all the songs and singing them and just kind of getting into the writing was what brought that band to me more than anything. Was just being oh yeah, these are water and airtight, perfect songs for the most part. There's some shaggy stuff in there later, but for the most part, yeah. I mean, it's what I think it's a Klosterman article where he's the Beatles are often considered the best pop band of all time because they wrote all the best songs. And it's yeah, that's kind of it. Well, hard pressed. I mean, even grading on the curve of there was less music back then, they're still just perfect. They're perfect buildings, that have not eroded or faded at all. And they were built with apparently lucking into seamless construction. And the thrust of that piece that I read of yours was so beautiful is that Revolver is one of the last times when all of those elements were working directly in concert with each other rather than as becoming these splintered factions that would then occasionally congeal into those bits of old magic. Real high watermark for collaboration.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, thank you for taking the time to read it. I mean, I love that you sort of discovered them through actually looking at the construction of their music, and I kind of
Yeah,
discovered
from the
them.
inside out.
Yeah,
I'd say.
and I
Yeah.
think I was the opposite. I think I first started to really listen to them when I was a little kid, and the Beatles anthology was on TV, and I experienced them first as a phenomenon, I guess.
Mhm.
And the story, I think it was their publicist, Derek Taylor, who is a real way with words. He's a real interesting guy. I think he called them the 20th century's greatest romance. And that line always stuck with me. And I know it maybe sounds a little corny, but I think that was what hit me first, was that it was just this thing that was so exciting and made people so happy. And, you know, I couldn't articulate when I was 7, 8, however old I was, hearing Twist and Shout and just how exciting that was. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just like,
Yeah, I do think. I mean, there's that like clickbait thing that goes viral every few years. That's just like people like stopping kids on the street and being like, "Do you know who the Beatles
Yeah.
are?" And it's like, yeah, but there was, even if that is waning, like, I don't know, man. I worked for a very brief time at like a rock camp for kids.
I didn't know that.
When I was in college, and like, first of all, you could just pick a Beatles song, and all these kids would already know it. Not musically, like not being able to play it, you would have to teach them on their instruments, but they would be like, "Oh yeah, that song." And then there was a guy there he had immigrated to the States from Senegal, and he was like, we were talking about just like different rock bands, and he was like, it's the Beatles and Michael Jackson. He was like, you can go in places where I'm from where people don't even speak English, and they know a dozen to 2 dozen Beatles songs, you know, and they know Michael Jackson. And like that's just like the level of cultural.
It's like Coke.
Yeah.
It's like bottles of Coke. It's like the number of people I've heard that said they learned how to speak English from Beatles songs and I Love Lucy episodes. I mean, it's just that's.
I Love Lucy. Okay. All right. Well, on to the fucking album.
Yeah, Revolver. I love it because every song on this album is its own distinct offering. I mean, they worked for 11 weeks, tackling songs in really every style. You got funk grooves, you got chamber music, you got sea shanties, you got psych rock, Indian ragas, and music hall piano ditties. And these weren't Moon and June love songs, but mature meditations on loneliness, laziness, insanity, grief, hope, death, and taxes. Lots of death on this album. I think I read that half the songs on the track list have lyrics that reference death or dying, which is interesting. The writer Dorian Linsky wrote in the LA Times, instead of settling on one new direction, on Revolver, the Beatles proposed 14 possibilities. I thought it was a really beautiful way to phrase that. I think this was the first time that they'd come to regard EMI Studios, later known as Abbey Road, as more than just a workspace, but a haven, because the world outside was getting so crazy. 1966 was the year of the famous Bigger Than Jesus controversy when they went on tour in the States. This was after they recorded Revolver, but there were riots and the Klan were picketing their shows and there was very serious concerns for their safety. This was, as I said, after they recorded Revolver, but even before that, things were getting so tumultuous. This was the period of them just beginning to feel safer in their little bubble. A lot of people think that their follow-up 1967 Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is their definitive work of studio construction, but I really think it's Revolver. It was the last album released while they were still a road band, and none of the songs were ever performed live. But I think that because there were these time constraints imposed by tours and other sort of business of Beatlemania, it makes the album a bit more focused and a bit tighter. There was more precision to their experiments.
Yeah, they still had that road chemistry.
Yeah,
that is just, and I mean, it's a muscle. It's any band, what tour tight means. And that's a thing, you know. And like when you stop playing live, you lose that. It's facts, it's like you stop jogging at the gym and then you can't jog as fast or whatever anymore. It's like, and you can obviously be creative in all kinds of other ways. And Sgt. Pepper's has all kinds of interesting sound experiments and everything, but it's not the Cavern Club chemistry,
That's what George would say during the Beatles anthology. He said he didn't really like that album too much because they weren't playing as a band that much. It would just be, Paul doing an overdub and then Ringo keeping time. And it just was a lot more biddy, I think was the word he used. And that was part of the reason why this box set took forever to come about, was that they did all the backing tracks live to tape. And so you couldn't remix that because it was all basically baked into one track. Paul had this great quote right before Revolver came out. He said, "I, for one, am sick of doing sounds that other people can claim to have heard before." And I just think that's wonderful because until Revolver arrived on August 5th, 1966, few people had ever heard anything like it. I really think that it's an album that legitimized left turns in popular music. I mean, because you had Bob Dylan the year before going electric at Newport Folk, which probably the first serious turning point for a major popular figure embracing a new style in a very public way. But the style that he embraced actually brought him more towards the commercial center. You know, this is 1965. It's the era of folk rock. It's almost like he's imitating his imitators like the Byrds by picking up an electric guitar. So that doesn't really work for me as legitimizing the left turn. You got Brian Wilson getting a little closer earlier in 1966 when he released Pet Sounds, beautiful Baroque pop masterwork, but didn't really sell all that well. It was seen as kind of a disappointment.
Right.
So really, the first album that I can think of that sold in a major way that proved you could take a risk and your fans would follow you was
I mean,
Revolver.
is that your qualification? Is it had to have sold?
Yeah, I mean, if Paul McCartney were here, and God, I wish he was, he would say one of the knocks against me is that I'm called commercial, as if that's a bad thing. But like, that's how I know that what I'm doing is any good, is if it connects with people. I don't see anything wrong with that.
No, I'm just maybe disagreeing that this was. There's other things that were interesting in music, but you're right, they were not popular on this.
But
scale.
just to show that you could be a major successful artist and make a serious change to your sound and your style, and it wasn't career suicide, I think was
Miles Davis, motherfucker.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. You and your jazz.
I was gonna say you can always pull out Miles Davis as a rejoinder to literally anything. No, but I mean, yeah, you're right. The argument there is just that nobody had achieved this level of visibility taking this kind of left-hand turn.
Yeah.
In terms of willful perversion of what made them,
Yeah. But in this
huge.
case, it was successful on every metric you could imagine, critically, commercially. Anyway.
Yeah. Moving on.
We should probably, this is the longest preamble we've ever had to an already very long episode, or should I say 2 episodes. We're not going to go chronologically on this episode. Instead, we're going to go track by track. And if you like, I encourage you to throw on the record and listen to each track as we go. Hopefully you'll find some new things to appreciate. Any excuse to listen to Revolver, I think, is a good thing. So we're going to make this a 2-parter. In fact, I'm not even going to give you any teasers for this episode. We're just going to dive in. Listen on for everything you didn't know about side 1 of the Beatles' Revolver. At the dawn of 1966, the Beatles were at a crossroads. We haven't busted that out in a while. They were, without question, the biggest band in the world. Popularity-wise, you couldn't get any bigger, and their latest album, Rubber Soul, released in December of 65, caught the attention of the most progressive minds in music, most notably Brian Wilson, who would make Pet Sounds in an attempt to equal it. As I said, they were a success on essentially every level, and that success brought limitations as a result of their immense fame, but also freedom. And in short, you can start to see the Beatles begin to say no. For Christmas 1965, they backed out of doing their annual Christmas pantomime show, which we don't really have an equivalent in the United States. It's this hokey, old-fashioned British showbiz tradition thing where you get dressed up in ridiculous costumes and basically put on an elementary school quality review with skits and songs, almost like a nativity play. Yeah, it's strange. And they'd done it the previous 2 years, but no more. And they also backed out of a proposed feature film that they were slated to make at the start of 1966 called A Talent for Loving, which was this Western parody. It kind of looks awful, based on a novel by Richard Condon. And this was to be the 3rd movie they were contracted to do for United Artists, following A Hard Day's Night and Help. But they were unable to find a suitable script, and the idea was scrapped. The Beatles had been scheduled to film this movie and record the soundtrack for the first few months of 1966, and then when that went away, it left them with their biggest break really since Beatledom began. After averaging 2 albums and 3 singles annually, plus 2 movies and multiple global tours for the last 3 years, and then before that, all the years that they were workhorsing it in Hamburg, they appreciated the rest. And for the first time, they were free to pursue their own interests as adults, and they flourished. John Lennon spent his time probing the outer limits of his own consciousness with a mix of literature and drugs. Paul McCartney dove headfirst into London's vibrant underground art scene. Ringo spent time with his wife and newborn son and transformed his basement into a bar called the Flying Cow. Sorry. Had to get that in there.
Foregrounding Ringo's later troubles with alcoholism.
Yeah.
Maybe not the best
Building a bar
use
in
of
his basement.
time.
Yeah. And George, meanwhile, had begun his intense study of Indian music, which we'll get into. We'll get into all of these things in much greater detail shortly. And when they reconvened in the studio in April of 1966 for sessions for Revolver, they basically had the energy of students coming back from summer vacation. John said right before sessions began on April 6th, 1966, the next LP is going to be very different. And he wasn't usually one for understatement, but that's putting it mildly. That spring, the Beatles worked for 300 hours, practically an eternity, considering their debut LP was mostly recorded in a single day. And the tone was set on day one with Tomorrow Never Knows, which we'll talk about in the second part of this episode. This stunning avant-garde soundscape that recreated a psychedelic experience through electric tape loops, India modalities, and obtuse impressionistic lyrics that were cribbed from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Any one of those elements that I just mentioned, unheard of in mainstream pop at the time, blended all of those elements together, it's one of the Beatles' boldest musical statements. And in my opinion, if it were somehow possible to objectively measure and graph the Beatles' creative progress, the gap between the session for Tomorrow Never Knows and their previous recording date, November 11th, 1965, finishing off the Rubber Soul cuts, You Won't See Me, Girl, Wait, and I'm Looking Through You, that is probably their single greatest creative leap of their career.
I would second that.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Think about all those songs I just mentioned off Rubber Soul and put them up against Tomorrow Never Knows. Like, you can't compare. I mean, that's...
I can't believe they tried to start this with Tomorrow Never Knows.
Oh, they succeeded in starting it with Tomorrow Never Knows.
I mean, yeah, but just what an odd choice.
Yeah, we will get to that. But yeah, that's a hell of a 5-month creative jump right there. Anyway, let's start talking about the album. The album starts off with Taxman, which opens with a woozy, let's say it, stoned 1, 2, 3, 4 count in from, I think, McCartney, who last performed the honors while kicking off their debut LP, Please Please Me, with I Saw Her Standing There 3 years earlier. You know, he starts off, I Saw Her Standing There, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, one of the great, I think I did a listicle at VH1, the best count-ins in rock history. That's got to be up there.
Every Ramones song with Dee Dee.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not even fully pronouncing the words at some point. This is their most stoned phase, right? Like this is like they'd finally gotten a hold of the devil marijuana.
Yeah, there's an outtake. It was on the anthology set too, but it's on the new Revolver set where John and Paul are on a mic together trying to do backing vocals for And Your Bird Can Sing. And they just are howling with laughter for just 2 minutes straight. Like, you can hear the spit coming out of their mouths into the mic because they're laughing so hard. They're snorting. Just, it's so funny. It's so, like, it's the most pure display of friendship I think I've ever heard on record of those two. It's actually pretty adorable. They're just the whole thing. You can't listen to it and not
that
laugh.
Or the Hey Bulldog backing vocals.
Oh, that's
a deep, also a bit of a deep cut.
Oh, that's one of my favorite songs of theirs.
Yeah, Hey Bulldog whips.
Yeah. But yeah, this intro for Taxman, I was never sure, but I always got the sense that they were intentionally parodying the opening of Please Please Me with I Saw Her Standing There with that 1, 2, 3, 4. And they were fond of doing like self-referential parodies. On the video for Hello Goodbye, they wave at the camera with their collarless She Loves You era suits, even though that was just 4 years earlier. It's like several lifetimes ago. And then when they were recording All You Need Is Love, John breaks into She Loves You at the end of the song when they're doing the fade out. And then also the original Get Back cover showed the Beatles revisiting the staircase shot on their debut album, Please Please Me, as a nice little throwback there. They, on the original one, they have short hair and matching suits, and now they're, the 1969 era Beatles with long hair and beards. So they're not above self-referential parody, but intentional or not, this 4 count on Taxman signaled a new era. And this is actually the first topical song that the Beatles ever made, following in the footsteps of people like Bob Dylan, Curtis Mayfield, Barry McGuire with Eve of Destruction, Buffy St. Marie, Universal Soldier.
It also kicks off the rich tradition in British music and elsewhere of the fabulously wealthy complaining about the travails of being fabulously wealthy. Although it is up. I mean, the tax rate was like what, 91%, something absurd.
Oh, it's higher.
Like
it was like 96%. The British Labour government had instituted what they called a super tax, which that sounds bad. Like they definitely needed a new PR rep. So for every £1 million that the Beatles earned in 1966, they were allowed to keep less than 50,000. Can you imagine? Like that's insane. I have to say, I am on George's side for this one. And in his mind, the vast majority of his money was being stolen by the British government to finance bombers and bombs. So there was an element of righteous indignation there too. I mean, again, this is Vietnam era. But also, he was just pissed. As he said during the Beatles anthology, you're so happy that you finally started earning money, and then you find out about tax with super tax and surtax and tax. It was just ridiculous. A heavy penalty to pay for making money. Anybody who ever made any money moved to America or somewhere else. And yeah, you have the Stones moving to France. Keith Moon, John Lennon, Rod Stewart, and all sorts of British rockers became tax exiles and settled in LA in the 70s when they basically all realized that they had no money left over from their 60s success. The Beatles got pretty terrible tax advice. Ringo once told this story where they got a guy to go live in the Bahamas and try to hold on to their money there so they wouldn't have to pay tax on it. And he said, and then in the end, we got found out and we had to bring all the money back, pay taxes on it, and then pay this guy. So we might as well have just left it where it was.
The common logline about George Harrison's time in the Beatles is that he was consistently given short shrift. There's that... we were talking about this earlier on Twitter, the part in Walk Hard when it's Jack Black, Paul Rudd, Justin Long, and Jason Schwartzman is the Beatles, and they cut over to Justin Long as George Harrison. He's like, I'm just trying to think about getting a few more songs on the albums. But Revolver has 3 of his solo tracks on it, the most he would ever get on a single disc Beatles album.
So not the White Album.
And the fact that he got the coveted side 1 track 1 position is a testament to the quality of his songwriting in this era. Lennon also quietly pitched in on the lyrics to Taxman, although it took him over a decade to actually admit to it. He said, I remember the day he, George, called to ask for help on Taxman, one of his first songs. I threw in a few one-liners to help the song along because that's what he asked for. He came to me because he couldn't go to Paul. Paul wouldn't have helped him in that period. Ooh. I didn't want to do it. I just sort of bit my tongue and said, okay. It had been John and Paul for so long. George had been left out because he hadn't been a songwriter up until then. And there is an early handwritten draft of the song in George's book, I Me Mine, and it lacks something of the sarcasm and biting wit of the final version. The line in George's book include, you may work hard trying to get some bread, you won't make out before you're dead, and so give into conformity. Now, what I let you keep for free. Ooh.
Yeah.
Clunkers.
A little clunky, yeah.
John was apparently always hurt that George never gave him props for helping him out with this, saying he was slightly resentful of George's book. And apparently they were just not on great terms when John died, which is a real bummer.
Yeah.
George would later say in the 80s, I didn't say he'd written one line of the song Taxman, but I also didn't say... Wait, right?
But I also didn't say how I'd written 2 lines of Come Together or 3 lines of,
Yeah. Well, it's like the band, we always go back to the thing about the band where it's like, you fit 1 or 2 names in the songwriting credits, but when you're hanging out in a studio with people and you're bouncing ideas around, like that's not the way songs get written,
Yeah, we'll talk more about this on a bunch of songs, just on Revolver. But yeah, there are a lot of people that just happen to be in the band's orbit who said that they later pitched in a line or so and didn't really think about asking for credit because it was just not, Donovan, the singer Donovan said he added the line, sky of blue and sea of green on Yellow Submarine. And it was just like, I wasn't expecting to get, a percentage of that song because I contributed that. It's just like what happens when you're a bunch of creative people sitting around.
He taught Lennon the finger picking patterns.
He did for Julia, and Dear Prudence.
Speaking of guitars, despite George Harrison's status as the official lead guitarist of the Beatles, that solo in Taxman, which does rip ass, rules, was played by Paul McCartney on his Epiphone Casino, a guitar he loved because it fed back really well, and he still owns it to this day. Didn't those potatoes and Oasis casinos?
Yeah, Sheridan's, I think.
Sheridan's.
I think they had Sheridan's with the Union Jack. Yeah, that guitar, I mean, Paperback Writer, the intro to that's played on it. Like, yeah, that guitar that's seen some battles. I think the opening of Sgt. Pepper too. I think he's playing that on it.
And this could have maybe rubbed George the wrong way, but he took it very well, at least in public. I always remember this quote that he said, I was pleased to have Paul play that bit on Taxman. If you notice, he did a little Indian bit on it for me, which is either super passive aggressive or just actually kind of nice. That like, hey, you took the guitar solo on my song, but you made a half-hearted attempt to make it sound like it was me. Jeff Emmerich's memoir, Here, There, and Everywhere, makes it sound as if
engineer. So, but Jeff Emmerich is the engineer.
Oh, yeah.
On Revolver.
I forget what company we're in, and that we're going to have to start introducing these minor characters as opposed to just a bunch of Beatles fans who are like, oh, yeah, Jeff Emmerich. Engineer Jeff Emmerich, who is, I don't know, there's been like 5 fifth Beatles. There's Billy Preston, George Martin.
George Martin.
Yeah. Jeff Emmerich is
high on the list of fifth Beatle candidates. Yeah.
Deservedly placed up there. He wrote in his memoir, which is called Here, There, and Everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He says that he makes it sound as if Paul got tired of watching George not be able to play that solo and just grabbed the guitar from him and cracked off that solo. He said they even tried to slow the tape down so that he could play it slower. He wrote, after a couple hours of watching him struggle, both Paul and George Martin started becoming quite frustrated. This was, after all, a Harrison song and therefore not something anyone was prepared to spend a whole lot of time on.
Aww.
Ouch. So George Martin went into the studio and, as diplomatically as possible, announced that he wanted Paul to have a go at the solo instead. I could see from the look on Harrison's face that he didn't like the idea one bit, but he reluctantly agreed and then proceeded to disappear for a couple of hours.
Oh.
He sometimes did that, had a bit of a sulk on his own, and then eventually came back. Woof.
Yeah, that book is... George really doesn't come across well in the first half of that book. He really comes across as kind of a screw-up. And then his growth as a player and as a songwriter is a huge part of the narrative arc of Emmerich's memoir.
I mean, it is interesting when you think about his actual guitar playing, just as a lead guitarist. I mean, on all that early stuff, it's like kind of Chet Atkins, like twangy rockabilly stuff. And then, the mood at the time was going towards like the cream blues rock, like really amplified, like this kind of guitar sound. And I can imagine him not really being able to summon that up, I
think it really came into his own around like the Delaney and Bonnie era in like 69, 70 when he was doing all the slide stuff on All Things Must Pass.
The slide,
like, that's my favorite George.
The solos on the later stuff, Abbey Road, are really great. His solos in the end when they're trading guitar solos back and forth, he had really strong hands, man. Some of those bends that he does are really hefty.
Yeah.
This is your favorite guitar solo?
Yes.
In Beatles history.
I think my second place is the electric solo that he does for Till There Was You at the Royal Variety Performance in 63. But number one for me, Taxman solo. So good. I don't really know where to put this, but there's a bit of the song where they sneak in a bit of the Batman theme by the Marquettes, which rules. Instead of saying, the backing vocals, Taxman, they go Batman.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I was trying to figure out what bass Paul played on this because
it's not the Rick.
I thought it might be the Rick. I'm not sure.
I think it's the Rick. Sounds like
this
the Rick.
This is when people talk about his James Jamerson era.
Yeah.
Which is a bit fatuous for me. To me, this sounds more like Stax. Like this sounds something that would have been on like Duck Dunn might have played for the Stax band. If you're talking about the 60s annals of great R&B, soul, Motown session bassists, James Jamerson is the top of the mountain bassist for Motown. Donald Duck Dunn probably comes in number 2 for recording for Stax, but the Stax sound was always a little bit more rough-edged and a little bit more simplistic than Motown, not as a knock. But this vamp in particular, gang, gang.
Yeah.
That always smacked a little bit more of Stax than Motown to me.
Well, they were going to record this at Stax.
At Stax, yeah.
And then we'll talk more about that a little later. But yeah, it fell through. I guess they wanted too much money, and also I think somebody associated with the Stax studio let the word get out, and there were security concerns. But there were even rumors that Elvis was going to let them stay at Graceland. Like, it's just hilarious. Yeah.
To be a fly on that wall.
Oh my God, yeah, I know. But just like watching Peter Sellers movies and stuff all the time. I'd say Taxman and Gotta Get You Into My Life are really the only two songs that I could see being like possibly benefited by being recorded at Stax. Everything else, and we'll talk more about this later, I think it would have been a disservice to the album.
Yeah, trying to all the like Southern fried crackers at Stax, watching them slog through take after take of semi-competent sitar playing. George was not especially known for his love of touring, but he did embark on a brief tour of Japan for a few weeks in December of 91 with his friend Eric Clapton. Wah, wah. For these shows, they stretched Taxman into a slightly longer version, during which Clapton took 2 solos, as was his wont, and George sang a new and updated verse. If I reduce it again, you'll see, Boris Yeltsin, get back more at the VAT. Mr. Bush. So
VAT,
biting
some kind of
political
British tax
satire.
thing,
Yeah. Biting stuff. But the new bridge is, if you get ahead, I'll tax your hat. If you get a pet, I'll tax your cat. If you wipe your feet, I'll tax the mat. If you're overweight, I'll tax your fat.
It's good.
My favorite George Eric moment is in Concert for Bangladesh when a coke blind and drunk Eric Clapton grabbed the wrong guitar and is playing that Gretsch Country Gentleman, and George rolls over and just spanks him in their little guitar duel that they would do. I had always heard that he was too gacked up and literally grabbed the big orange. It's either Chet Atkins or I think it is the Chet Atkins model.
Yeah.
And his tone is it's not the Clapton tone, and he's not playing the Strat, and he's just kind of fumbling, and George comes over and is like, "Oh, I can actually play right now. Why don't you sit down?" I always loved that moment for George. Clapton, a grave digger of a guitarist, a ditch digger of a guitarist. Oh, you could quote me on that one.
Who was the actual ditch digger in classic rock? Was that Robert Plant? Didn't he also or no, Rod Stewart? Was he a grave digger?
Was he a grave digger? Probably.
I think so.
That tracks.
I think he was. Yeah.
Ow!
Grave digging. This brings us to Eleanor Rigby. How is that segue? It's interesting that Eleanor Rigby is actually one of the most contested songs in the Lennon-McCartney canon in terms of lyrics. John always claimed that he added a significant portion of the lyrics. He said up to 70%. And his quote was a great quote. "It was Paul's baby, but I assisted with the education of the child." John said that Paul had written the first verse and the general theme of the song, but the rest of the lyrics was John's. He remembers that they had a group writing session at his house after a Beatle dinner party, and they all kind of convened in the living room to try to finish it off. And also the Beatles historian Robert Rodriguez, who wrote an amazing book about Revolver, has claimed that the original lyric sheet for Eleanor Rigby features the song's key lyric, "Look at all the lonely people," written in Harrison's hand. So it's a possibility that George kicked in a few lines too. And John remembers getting up and going to the bathroom during this group writing session at the house. He said, "I left to go to the toilet. I heard someone say that line, 'Look at all the lonely people,' and I turned around and said, 'That's it.'" This is his cigar chopping executive moment. However, John's old school friend, Pete Shotton, who was like basically his best friend before Paul came into the picture, he happened to be visiting John's house that night, the night of this Eleanor Rigby writing session, and he claims that John's contribution was virtually nothing. In fact, this guy Pete Shotton says that he was the one who came up with the idea to end the song with Eleanor Rigby's death, and John said, "I don't think you get what we're trying to do here, Pete," and basically slagged him off. Both George Martin and John Lennon have said that the lyrics were unfinished when it came time to record the song in the studio, and that both George Martin, roadies Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall, and possibly John helped finish it off while Paul worked out an arrangement somewhere else. So now we have Paul, John, George, John's friend Pete Shotton, George Martin, and roadies Mal and Neil all up for potential credit on Eleanor Rigby. Make of that what you will. It's like we were talking about earlier. A bunch of creative people in a room ideas get exchanged, it's hard to really assign a credit. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment. Paul McCartney famously can't read music and is not a trained musician by any stretch of the imagination, but for a brief time in the mid-60s, he took a handful of composition lessons from a teacher at the Guildhall School of Music. And this was probably on the advice of his girlfriend Jane Asher's mother, who once taught oboe at this music school. In fact, George Martin was one of her students. Isn't that weird? Paul's almost mother-in-law taught George Martin when he was a student. I think that's crazy.
I just, there's something so humanizing about hearing the little parts where Paul's genius bumps up against his actual limitations, you know? Like, didn't you, I think it was in your piece where George Martin was trying to tell him what string vibrato was, and he couldn't tell the difference.
Oh, you can hear it on the box set. They have these great session rehearsals, and George gets the string players to play a bit with vibrato and a bit without, and you hear Paul come over the talkback. George is like, "Oh, Paul, can you tell the difference?" And Paul comes through the talkback and goes, "Oh, not really, no, sorry." It's just great. But yeah, I mean, speaking of Paul's limitations, he had this composition teacher, and he played him Eleanor Rigby, an early version of it. The composition teacher didn't think much of it. Basically said, I don't know, I'm not sure if that's any good. And Paul stopped his lessons soon after. He said, I went off him when I showed him Eleanor Rigby because I thought he'd be interested, and he wasn't. I thought he might be intrigued by the little time skips.
He was not.
No, I mean, if you think about it, it's really just, it's an exercise in vamping. I mean, it's like two chords, basically.
Which is what he said it was almost more of an Indian song before it was arranged by George Martin for a string quartet. Indian music is mostly static harmony.
Doesn't modulate one chord.
Yeah, tremendously virtuosic scalar playing, but not really known for its wide array of chords. McCartney apparently made a demo tape of this at Ringo's old apartment in Montague Square in the presence of William Burroughs.
Yeah.
Hopefully had been disarmed. The apartment had been turned into an ad hoc spoken word studio for Paul's avant-garde buddies, hence the reason Burroughs was there. Donovan, making his second appearance in this episode, said that he also heard it around this time and echoed the fact that when he originally heard it, it sounded like an Indian track. He says that the words at the time were Ola Natungi, blowing his mind in the dark with a pipe full of clay, no one can say, which is in keeping with Paul's habit of putting in placeholder nonsense syllables until he finds the final lyrics. The most famous example of this is, of course, in Yesterday. The main lyric was originally scrambled eggs. Scrambled eggs. Funnily enough, this dummy lyric may have come from a rather popular album of drumming music, Drums of Passion, 1960, by a Nigerian musician and activist named Michael Babatunde Olatunji. The album is called Drums of Passion from 1960. I feel like Ginger Baker has also talked about this record.
That would make sense. Yeah, it was. I think it was kind of big in like the hip London circles because Brian Epstein went on this show in England called Desert Island Discs, this radio show where you give your favorite songs, and that was one of the songs he chose.
Yeah, so that may have been where that name came from. Plus, he was name checked by Bob Dylan on I Shall Be Free. I don't know that. Yeah. That's wild. Originally, Father Mackenzie was Father McCartney, but Paul changed it so people didn't think he was singing about his dad. And they ultimately just consulted a phone book looking for names that would fit. Darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there was reportedly a line contributed by Ringo.
Well, that was a real concern about not wanting people to think he was singing about his own dad because, like that line, darning his socks by himself in the night when there's nobody there, like it's a sad fate for this character. And John's father, who abandoned him as a child, had recently been discovered by the tabloids working as a dishwasher. And all the headlines were like, why isn't John looking after his dad? Why is he like working as a dishwasher in all these pubs and stuff? And John was furious because this guy just like walked out of his life when he was a kid.
Yeah.
And like suddenly now he's being made to look bad for, I think his quote was something like, why am I not taking care of him? Why didn't he take care of me? And so it kind of led to this really kind of awkward reunion where I think John took care of him quietly, but didn't really want him in his life. So I think Paul probably felt the same way. It was like, no, I don't want to have a song where it sounds like my dad is this like, living in poverty.
Well, he's a rather clean old man.
That was his grandpa.
Yeah. Not actually his actual grandfather.
No.
The most mysterious line in the song, though, is definitively a contribution from Paul, wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door.
That's a great line.
I never thought that was particularly confusing. I thought it was very obviously about someone putting on makeup. You said this is confusing?
Really?
To people?
I thought it was very like, I don't know. I just always thought that it was a very mysterious turn of phrase. It's one of those phrases that's like, it's almost like Ringo's phrases, like a hard day's night or tomorrow never knows. Like those phrases that when you don't think about it too hard, it kind of makes sense. But as soon as you stop and actually look at the construction of it, you think, wait, what is that? What does that mean?
Like Yogi Berra. Deja vu all over again.
Yeah, exactly.
But Paul McCartney, put a hard stop on it on his book of lyrics that came out in 2021. He said, "My mom's favorite cold cream was Nivea, and I love it to this day. That's the cold cream I was thinking of in the description of the face Eleanor keeps in a jar by the door. I was always a little scared by how often women used cold cream."
Influencer Paul shouting out Nivea. Could have just said cold cream, but I love Nivea.
Paul.
I've loved Nivea my whole life, and I love it to this day. Paul McCartney for Nivea.
Always focused on the bag, Paul is. But where did the name actually come from? The character was based on an elderly woman that Paul used to go round and do errands for as a Boy Scout in Liverpool. He later wrote in his lyric book, "I found out she lived on her own, so I would go around there and just chat. Later, I would offer to go and get her shopping. We'd sit in her kitchen. So I would visit, and just hearing her stories enriched my soul and influenced the songs I would later write."
Paul loved old people. I love how
Paul
much he
does
loved
love old people.
Yeah. My favorite Paul old person story was when he lived with his girlfriend Jane Asher in their townhouse in the middle of London. It's middle of London. You can't just walk out the front door because he's Paul McCartney. All the fans know where he lives. He had to devise this goofy escape route where he lived at the top, this little like artist garret at the top of this townhouse. And so he talked to his neighbors and they devised this escape route where he would like walk along the roof to like the building next door, go down a floor to like a fire escape and in through this like old major's window that he would just like keep open for him. And the major, he'd just be like, "Oh, coming through, major." And the major would be like, "Oh, yep, hush, hush," and all that. Yeah. And he would, it's like, he got to know all these neighbors by just kind of like popping through their house and out the back alleyway to like a little mews behind the townhouse where they lived and could sneak out that way. I just love that.
Originally, the name that Paul used in the song was Daisy Hawkins.
I didn't even understand how it would fit in the lyrics.
Nope, doesn't scan. But he ditched it because he said it didn't sound real enough. It seemed too phony. He landed on Eleanor Rigby through a means that is somewhat contested. He says he borrowed Eleanor from the actress-comedian Eleanor Braun, who co-starred with the Beatles in the movie Help, and was a fixture on the London comedy scene. She appeared in reviews with people like Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. Paul also claims that John had an affair with her, so make of that what you will. And then he says that Rigby came from the name of a liquor store that he saw in Bristol where his girlfriend Jane Asher was performing a play. I thought, ooh, it's a very ordinary name, and yet it's a special name. It was exactly what I wanted. So Eleanor Rigby. I felt great. I'd got it. It's Paul McCartney just gassing himself up about a song that's sold millions and millions of copies. I did a great job. However, his friend, the playwright Lionel Bart, claims that they were walking together past a graveyard in London, and he saw the name Eleanor Bygraves, and that inspired the name. But it gets weirder. In the Liverpool suburb of Woolton, in the very churchyard that John and Paul had their famous meeting, is a gravestone for an Eleanor Rigby, mere feet from the spot where the two Beatles met. He later said, "It was either complete coincidence or in my subconscious. I suppose it was more likely in my subconscious, because I have been amongst those graves knocking around with John. It was the sort of place we used to sunbathe, but there could have been 3,000 gravestones in Britain with Eleanor Rigby on. It is possible I saw it and subconsciously remembered it. So subconscious it may be, but this is just bigger than me. I don't know the answer to that one."
I just want to talk about the fact that they were sunbathing in a graveyard.
I mean, that's very goth of them.
It's very Donnie Darko.
Minus the fact they're getting a tan at all. But that does that sounds like something Morrissey would have done.
Oh my. So the song Eleanor Rigby became the first one, I believe, that none of the Beatles actually play on, although they did arrange a 3-part harmony on the chorus. Although it sounds like John sang all the lovely people at points. So although he did have a hard time with lyrics, so maybe he just got it wrong.
He had a learning disability.
I don't think he did.
Was he dyslexic?
No.
Oh, all right.
I don't think so.
He was stoned.
Okay, yeah. No. George Martin's string octet arrangements borrow the spiky staccato string punctuations from Bernard Herrmann's soundtrack to Psycho. If you think about it, it sounds a lot like the Psycho theme in the shower. Fun fact, 2 of the string players in the Eleanor Rigby session also played strings on Yesterday. George Martin claimed that it was his idea to do the string arrangement, but said that Paul initially resisted the idea because he was worried that it would come across as, quote, too Mancini, which is obviously not the case with these harsh, biting sounds. I mean, you could, in a lesser producer's hands, it could have easily descended into like, sad old woman with, bring in the strings, like bring in the world's smallest violin kind of thing right there. Yeah.
No, it's a great arrangement.
Oh, it's an incredible arrangement. Yeah. Both John and Paul claim that it was Paul's original idea to have these strings because I guess Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend, extremely cultured woman, had turned Paul onto Vivaldi's Four Seasons concertos. And that was another inspiration for how he wanted the strings to sound. In any event, I love those close mic'd strings. And I guess at the time, it was customary to mic string groups with 1 or 2 mics from a distance of several feet. But engineer Jeff Emmerich moved the mics to just like an inch or 2 away from the players. And you could just really hear the scrape of the horsehair bow on the strings.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't not only that they were super close, it was that he was miking them down by the bridge, right?
I think so. I think that might also be an element,
which is where you get the harshest bow tone from.
Yeah.
I mean, if
it's percussive.
Yeah, and on any string instrument, the closer that you play to where it's anchored, the tighter the tension on the string is going to be. And when you do that with a bowed instrument, that's when it can get really spiky, gritty. As you said, percussive and shrill and gritty.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually used as like an avant-garde, like extended technique in string playing. You're generally supposed to play it closer to a midpoint between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge.
And the players were not happy about this. Whenever Jeff Emmerich would try to move the mics closer, they kept scooching their chairs back. Yeah. And eventually George Martin had to come on the talk back in the studio and just tell them to stop moving. And I guess the players were still not very happy with it because reportedly they declined to listen to the playback. In addition to Paul's composition teacher not thinking much of Eleanor Rigby, another person who wasn't that impressed was Kinks composer Ray Davies. He reviewed Revolver as part of a feature for the Disc and Music Echo magazine in 1966, and he was not especially kind. Of Eleanor Rigby, he said, quote, "It sounds like they're out to please music teachers in primary schools. I can imagine John saying, 'I'm going to write this for my old schoolmistress.' Still, it's very commercial." And he also declared Yellow Submarine, quote, "a load of rubbish, really. I think they know it's not that good." And finally, for Tomorrow Never Knows, a song that revolutionized 20th century music, he wrote, this is, I think, his best capsule review, quote, "Listen to all those crazy sounds. It'll be popular in discotheques. I can imagine they had George Martin tied to a totem pole when they did this."
Yeah, I mean, Ray Davies is a prick. Also, that's rather rich. We're talking about a guy who stabbed his guitarist brother in the hand with a fork over a French fry. But that's rich of him, coming from Village Green Preservation Society, which is all about the most, like, whimsical, let's preserve the vanishing traditions of England you can imagine. And I think he's conflating the wrong kind of Indian there, so it's also super racist. Totem pole. He's confusing different kinds of Indians.
I didn't even think about that. I just thought it was a weird thing to tie someone to.
Come on, Ray.
Well,
speaking of Indians, speaking of the correct kind of Indian music,
George had used his Beatle break for the first couple months of 1966 to dive deeper into his studies of Indian music, which, Hilariously, he'd been first exposed to on the set of Help. This was during the scene when they were shooting in an Indian restaurant, and there was a group of Indian musicians playing what was essentially an Indian parody. And he picked up a cheap sitar not long after screwing around with one on the set in 1965, and he used it on Norwegian Wood to add a little color to the track at the very last minute. And that really could have been the end of it, but George broke a string on the sitar, and to rescue them, George Martin called a member of the Asian Music Circle in London to help repair it, which was this organization of Indian musicians. And George got close to these people, and through them he began to learn the intricacies of Indian music. And also around the same time, George was turned on to the music of Ravi Shankar by reportedly David Crosby and Roger McGuinn of the Byrds, whose love of Indian modalities is clear on stuff like 8 Miles High and the song Why. I guess the Byrds learned about him because the owner of a studio where the Byrds made their demos had produced Ravi Shankar. This guy, Dick Bach at World Pacific, I think is the name, is very famous kind of hit label.
I always thought they
LA.
might have gotten through it through Coltrane, because John Coltrane is a big Ravi Shankar fan, and 8 Miles High is a quote from is built around a quote from a Coltrane tune called, I believe, India.
I think so, yeah.
It's funny. This song is probably my least favorite on this record, to be perfectly honest.
Love You Too?
Yeah. It's great, but it's like, I don't know. My whole thing about George and the sitar is I think it's deployed well on like Norwegian Wood. That's my favorite use of it, but he really should have just waited a year for the Dan electric sitar to come out, because that instrument is so much better deployed in everything that would come after it. Like, I think of Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours is the perfect use of the electric sitar, and then on this you've got
That's in that?
Yeah, that's the Dan Electro.
I had no idea that was what that was.
Yep. And I don't think old George pulled it off super well on this one.
Well, he'd only been playing for
I know,
than a year.
and it's
And I think
Indian
it's an
music
instrument that you supposedly require several lifetimes to master. So
yeah, it's crazy. They don't even let you. Indian music is nuts. They don't even let you pick up an instrument until you learn all the clapping patterns with the syllables, like scatting. Like it's admirable he tried, and it's a testament to the juice that they had that this made it onto a record.
no.
They're like, okay, George, do your thing.
So George went to a Ravi Shankar concert in early 1966, and it just blew his mind. It totally turned him on to the possibilities of this exotic instrument. And he told the journalist Maureen Cleave in early 1966, I couldn't believe it. It was just like everything you've ever thought of as great, all coming out at once. Oh, Excited George is my favorite George. And he began practicing the sitar apparently every day, and reportedly Love You Too was one of the first songs, if not the first song, that he specifically wrote on the instrument. To me, it's the most interesting of George's 3 diversions into Indian music, because unlike something like Within You, Without You, it does have some traditional rock sounds, like the fuzzed out Strat and Paul's bass in the background. So that makes it an interesting blend to me.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier that George is excited about it, and it is really adorable. He said at the time, to me, Indian music is the only really great music now, and it makes Western 3 or 4 beat type stuff seem somehow dead. You can get so much more out of it if you're really prepared to concentrate and listen. I hope more people will try to dig it. It's interesting, though, that George's love for the music was shared by the rest of the Beatles, including John Lennon. He said, it's amazing, this, so cool. Although he...
Not one for idle praise.
Yeah, he did not contribute to this in the studio. There's outtakes and rehearsal tapes that you can actually hear the rest of the band being as excited about this stuff as George was, with McCartney working out this alternate harmony that is ultimately left off. Funnily enough, George did not have a title for this song.
Never had titles.
Yeah, he was terrible at titles. Stephen King is bad at endings. George Harrison is bad at titles. Jeff Emmerich called it Granny Smith for a while after his favorite type of apple. Which, yeah, I didn't put that together. That's the logo for Apple Records.
Yeah.
And then we're recording another George song, which would become I Want to Tell You. He didn't have a title for that, and you can hear John in the background of the session tape saying, let's call it Granny Smith Part Friggin' 2. But they ultimately went with another kind of apple, Laxton's Superb, which is a British ass way to name an apple if I've ever heard one. So there's your brief Beatles apple sidebar. The fruit, not the record label.
This brings us to I'm Only Sleeping. So John Lennon might have been one of the best songwriters of the 20th century and a genius of the human spirit, but the dude was lazy. In a 1966 profile in the London Evening Standard written by the brilliant Maureen Cleave, who was his friend, she described him as, quote, possibly the laziest person in England. John's also quoted in the article describing himself as, quote, physically lazy. I don't mind writing or reading or watching or speaking, but sex is the only physical thing I can be bothered with anymore. He spent his days mostly horizontal at Kenwood, the 27-room luxury estate that he shared with his wife Cynthia and 3-year-old son Julian in the staid upper-class London suburb of Weybridge, and he'd never been happy in the area. He just basically moved there at his accountant's suggestion, and Kenwood was the third house they viewed that day, and he was like, I'll take it, just fine. And spent his days basically watching TV and dropping out. And this was around the same period when he kept a mortar and pestle close at hand to mash together whatever pharmaceuticals he had at hand into one giant unpredictable mega pill.
That is, people's cavalier attitudes towards pharmacology back in this era continue to astound me. I just finished this Charles Mingus biography, and there's an anecdote in there where Mingus went to go see Monk play, and he goes backstage, and there was just a shoebox full of loose pills. Or one of them says to the other one, do you want to get high? The other one goes, yeah. So they just reach in and grabbed a handful of whatever and just tossed it back. Like, good Lord.
All this to say, John was usually asleep when Paul arrived from London in the morning to start their songwriting sessions. How annoying must a chipper Paul McCartney be moments after you woke up? I'm a Paul guy, but Jesus Christ.
Wakey, wakey, John.
Yeah. So that's where you get
comes
the Genesis.
Into the room playing the bass. Boom, 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 boom. We're gonna write a song, John.
Playing Yellow Submarine. So this is the genesis of I'm Only Sleeping. And it's interesting to me that 3 out of John's 4 songs on Revolver are directly about or inspired by drugs and or altered consciousness. You've got Tomorrow Never Knows, She Said, which we'll talk about a little bit, and this one. He was really moving past the old style of, writing about relationships and love songs. And in a way, I'm Only Sleeping, I always kind of thought of it as the sequel to Nowhere Man on Rubber Soul. It's a commentary on his own laziness. Depending on how you look at it, it could also be the prequel to his double fantasy hit Watching the Wheels, in which he sings, people say I'm crazy doing what I'm doing. In I'm Only Sleeping, he thinks everyone else is crazy, running everywhere at such a speed, as the song goes. Now, the song's languid, dreamlike quality is due in part to the fact that the tape speeds on the song were manipulated through a process called varispeed. And the short, untechnical version of this is that the rhythm track was actually recorded faster and then slowed down to give it that plodding, lethargic tone. And weirdly, I don't really know why this is, John's own voice was sped up slightly by a semitone, which is what they did for When I'm 64 on Sgt. Pepper to make Paul sound younger. And I think that was actually inspired by Brian Wilson doing the same thing on Caroline No on Pet Sounds. They sped that up a semitone too.
All that stuff is really interesting to me. The San Francisco Tape Center, which actually started in the attic of the first building of my current employer, the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Paul's experimentations with musique concrete and tape speed and stuff are all often chalked up to guys like Karlheinz Stockhausen and stuff. But, you have to remember that the early minimalist guys were super into tape stuff. Steve Reich, particularly,
It's Gonna Rain.
Pauline Oliveros, Terry Riley. And this was all in the early part of the 60s. Like the Tape Center, San Francisco Music Tape Center it only lasted till 66. So yeah, the whole thing about tape speed and this, it's all really, really interesting to me, and people were doing really cool stuff with it. Like the guitar solo for this song, which is in fact played forwards and run backwards right?
Yes,
But played forwards in such a way that it would sound good backwards, which today you can probably do with a single pedal.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. This was like a whole day. Jeff Emmerich would talk about how, we talked about how George had a tough time with the solo for Taxman. They tried even recording it at a slower speed so that maybe he could nail it, but in the end they let Paul do it because he was a better lead guitarist. I'm sure Jeff Emmerich was not thrilled at watching George try to work out a solo all day and then try to figure out how to play it backwards.
Yeah, and these backwards experiments began earlier in the sessions for Revolver when they were recording the B-side to Paperback Writer Rain, but the results didn't make it onto the record, although the vocals at the end of the songs are reversed. And every single Beatle has told a different story as to how that happened. Lennon claims that during the sessions for Rains, he took a work tape home from the studio and got so high that he put the tape on backwards and decided that he preferred it that way. Paul, meanwhile, claims that one of the tape men put a tape on backwards during a playback and they decided to go with it. Kind of like the accidental feedback that introduces I Feel Fine. George Martin says that he intentionally reversed John's vocals because that was the kind of stuff that he did when he was making comedy records for the likes of Peter Sellers and the Goons, and just assumed that John would like it. But in any event, after this incident on Rain, engineer Jeff Emmerich wrote that almost every overdub we did on Revolver had to be tried backwards as well as forwards.
Which sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. He wrote that the session to track the backwards guitar solo took something like 5 hours. Writing somewhat cruelly of George, at the best of times he had trouble playing solos all the way through forwards, so it was with great trepidation that we all settled in for what turned out to be an interminable day of listening to the same 8 bars played backwards over and over and over again. I'm just from now remembering how much on Paul's dick Jeff Emmerich is in that book.
Yeah, because they worked together forever.
Extensive,
through up to like Tug of War and maybe even
perhaps,
on Flaming Pie.
Perhaps something of an unreliable narrator.
It ends nicer. Towards the end of the book, he starts talking about, George blossoming into an incredible writer and player. So,
but there's that great part in this song though when he says, towards the end of the song, right before one of those great bass breaks, you can hear John go, "Yawn, Paul." Which he does.
Well, it's good because the backwards solo sounds like somebody yawning, which I think is why it's so perfect for this song.
There's a short surviving fragment of a rehearsal take of this song that came out on Anthology 2 in 1996, where they have a version of this song based around a vibraphone part, which sounds amazing to me.
It's pretty cool. Have you heard it?
Who played it? No, who played it?
I think Paul.
Oh, okay.
If it's an unusual instrument that's not Indian, that is actually being played with any degree of skill, it's more often than not, it's Paul.
As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages.
And next up, the next track on Revolver is Here, There, and Everywhere, which is fitting after I'm Only Sleeping because Paul apparently wrote the majority of it while at John's house for a songwriting session, waiting for him to wake up and come downstairs. And this is a song that Paul has cited as one of his all-time favorites of anything he's ever done, as has George Martin, and so did John, which is great because I feel like so many people would assume that John would think this is, silly love song, but it's a gorgeous song. Paul tells the story of listening to a work tape with John of all the songs that they'd done so far for Revolver, and when Here, There, and Everywhere came on, John turned to him and said, I like that one more than any of mine on this tape. And as Paul himself would later say, John was not one to praise. He wouldn't praise anything unless he really liked it. We were playing the album and I remember him saying, I like this one. That was high praise coming from John. I just thought that was really sweet. Shortly before John's death, he would credit the song entirely to McCartney before saying it was one of my favorite songs of the Beatles. So I just think that's very sweet. It's really sad. I guess after Michael Jackson bought the Lennon-McCartney catalog in 1985, Paul said in an interview that he wished he had the option of buying back at least a few of the songs that he especially loved. And he specifically mentioned Here, There, and Everywhere in that.
It's a real kick in the dick.
I know.
I'm going to buy your songs, Paul.
Here, There, and Everywhere was famously written after John and Paul were treated to an early listen of the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds for the first time that spring, when pseudo Beach Boy Bruce Johnston had made a pilgrimage to the UK, where he fell in with Keith Moon and chaos ensued. Yeah, I think there's some story about Keith Moon starting a fight with him there and Bruce being like, I gotta get the hell out of here. This is all very fitting because, as we mentioned earlier, Brian Wilson had written Pet Sounds as a direct, friendly challenge to the Beatles after we'd heard their previous album, Rubber Soul, in December of '65. And you can hear the Beach Boys' influence on the harmonies for Here, There, and Everywhere, and also in the comparatively complex chord structures. And Paul was always proud of having the introduction of this song, which had the very kind of old-fashioned Irving Berlin, Cole Porter style, a piece of the song that doesn't really go anywhere. It's not a verse, it's not a chorus, it's just this own unique little tag on the beginning. Kind of like in Do You Want to Know a Secret? Do you never know how much I really love you? I love those little like pre-song intros.
I hate that song.
Really? Do you want to know a secret?
Listen.
Oh, that's great.
That's when my Stewie Beatles impression. Do you want to know a secret? It's just so grating. Sorry.
No. The lyrical framework to Here, There, and Everywhere is really pretty sophisticated.
What if I just contribute unprompted backing vocals as you're trying to do this?
You gotta do Frere Jacques from Paperback Writer.
Yeah.
The lyrical structure for Here, There, and Everywhere is really pretty sophisticated because you'll notice that the first verse opens with here, the second verse with there, and the third verse with everywhere. It's a very clever little circular rhyme scheme to work in the whole title of the song. I think that's cool. Interestingly, roadie Mal Evans, who we heard from while talking about Eleanor Rigby, and he's also a major breakout star of the Get Back documentary.
Doesn't he also play the bass drum on Yellow Submarine?
Yes, he does, and he played the anvil on Maxwell's Silver Hammer in Get Back, presumably on Abbey Road too. He's claimed that he wrote the line, "Watching her eyes and hoping I'm always there." He said, "I'm very eye conscious." And not to start a smear campaign against Paul McCartney, my favorite human being, but there's a theory that Mal helped out on a lot of song lyrics, including some stuff on Sgt. Pepper, but Paul basically paid him outright because the Lennon-McCartney brand was such a thing. This is according to Evans's diaries. He wrote on January 27th, 1967, Sgt. Pepper started writing a song with Paul upstairs in his room, he on piano, did a lot more of When the Rain Comes In, fixing a hole, hope people like it, and then on February 1st he wrote, Sgt. Pepper sounds good. Paul tells me that I will get royalties on the song. Great news. Perhaps now a new home. On February 2nd, recording vocals on Captain Pepper, as he mistakenly called it. All six of us doing the chorus in the middle. Worked until about midnight. And I guess there are tapes of him repeating these claims that were made before he died in 1976. It really tragic story. He was shot by an LA policeman when he waved a gun around when he was in this really drugged up state. His diaries, I think, are due to be published in the next year or so, and the great Beatles scholar Ken Womack is doing a biography of him due out next year. So yeah, I'm interested to hear more from Mal. He really had a front row seat to all the Beatle adventures. He knew them back in their cavern days when he was working for, I think, the British Telephone Service or something. And he was just a large man who could lift the big bass amp. And right when they started needing muscle and security, he kind of fit the bill, and he was a sweet guy, and they hired him, and he was along for the ride. Anyway, Here, There, and Everywhere was the next to last song recorded for Revolver and has a somewhat simple arrangement. And there are some who've wondered that if it had been brought in earlier in the sessions, George Martin might have done a bigger arrangement for it, something more along the lines of Yesterday or Eleanor Rigby. Notice that even the harmonies are pretty simple. George later admitted just basic triads, which the boys hummed behind and found very easy to do. There's nothing very clever, no counterpoint, just moving block harmonies. Very simple to do, but very effective. And As it was, the Beatles had a very hard out leaving for their tour of Germany, Japan, and the Philippines just a few days after the sessions were due to wrap. So maybe that's why the song's a little bit more stripped down, because they had to go. But I personally love it. I love that it's this really small, intimate arrangement. But Paul re-recorded Here, There, and Everywhere for the soundtrack to his misbegotten 1984 film Give My Regard to Broad Street, and he added a brass section, a horn section in place of the harmonies. So maybe that would have been the plan during Revolver if there was more time to make it more of like an old brass band number. And then there's this detail that I think a lot of people know, but I love. Paul says that he based his vocal performance on Marianne Faithfull singing in an almost falsetto voice.
Speaking of Yellow Submarine and Mal Evans, perhaps the biggest revelation on the Revolver box set is an early demo of Yellow Submarine. For decades, the received wisdom among Beatles fans was that this was a chipper sing-along, I almost said sing-song, it is sing-song, that McCartney had literally dreamed up for the avuncular Ringo to sing in that little twilight moment when silly ideas pop into your head. In other words, the kind of tuneful, happy-go-lucky track that John Lennon would later dismiss as Paul's granny music. One of the all-time disses in rock music. But a newly unearthed work tape reveals that the seeds of this song actually came from John Lennon, who strums an acoustic guitar while singing the mournful opening couplet, "In the place where I was born, no one cared, no one cared." Considering that Lennon's own father was a man who sailed to sea and all but abandoned him, it's tempting to read into this musical fragment as a part of the processing he did of his difficult childhood, placing it on a continuum of songs of his ranging from the then recent In My Life to Strawberry Fields Forever to his White Album ode to his late mother, Julia. And then subsequently the even more on-the-nose and harrowing confessionals of Plastic Ono Band in 1970, when he's literally just screaming.
Yeah. Songs called Mother and My Mummy's Dead. Yeah.
Yeah, tough. Jordan, when you were talking to Giles Martin, he made a point of mentioning how telling it was that John would let this song get glommed into Paul's chorus. Is that correct?
Yeah, he just said it was very telling that, like, it just was indicative of how close their working relationship was, or how they just kind of, it was, I think the word he used was empathy for each other's direction that they wanted to go. I mean, John had this piece of music that was clearly very, from a very hurt place. But yeah, he allowed Paul to come in and, you know, to borrow a phrase, take a sad song and make it better. Giles said to me, you know, originally the song was more like a Woody Guthrie thing, the sad, sensitive song. But the interesting thing about it is how Paul takes it. You can see him go, that's a nice melody. Why don't we try this with it? And this is Giles still talking. He said, and John hadn't gotten to that stage where he'd say, I don't want to go with your happy clappy stuff on this. But by Get Back, that had changed, and that's the difference. That's the difference in the Beatles' working relationship. John was, you know, kind of saying, "Oh, well, it's a great melody. Paul has a great chorus. We can make a really good hit song out of this." I think that in the not too distant future, John had something that was this personal to him. He probably would have kept it for himself and done what he wanted to do with it.
Making his fourth appearance on the pod, I've already lost count. Donovan, ladies and gentlemen, Sunshine Superman singer.
Mellow
Donovan.
Yellow.
Mellow Yellow. Friend of the pod, Donovan. Claims that he contributed the line, Sky of Blue and Sea of Green. Surely a description never appeared anywhere in the annals of the human language.
The technical staff were called upon to bring this nautical theme to life, and George Martin was actually out with food poisoning the day they recorded the basic rhythm tracks. But when he came back, he was in his element because he had a background working on all these comedy albums with the Goons, with, you know, big comedy stars in the UK, Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan, and they frequently employed his skills at using sound effects and sped up tape stuff and anything to just make them sound goofy. So this song is, you know, not that far removed from those kind of comedy records. And one of the effects was for the "and the band begins to play" part, where there's a brass band that's dropped in. And I love this. They did this very early in the morning after a long session, and everyone was too tired to make George strap on a guitar and come up with a 2-bar solo, because as we heard several times in this episode already, sometimes that was hard for George to do. So they decided to fill this space with a brass band instead, And for years, there was this mystery as to whether or not they actually hired a bunch of session players to play that little horn break in the middle of the song. Turns out it was a dubbed recording. George Martin would have never been able to get the budget to hire an entire band to play like 3 seconds of music. So they got a tape of the French March Le Rêve Passé from the Abbey Road Sound Effects tape, volume 46. And to get around any copyright issues, they just chopped up the tape and reassembled the pieces in random order to obscure the melody. And then they faded it out really fast. Another sound effect that was used was the cash register from the EMI sound library. That exact sound effect would eventually wind up on the Pink Floyd song Money 7 years later, since it was also recorded at EMI.
The cash register would later sue them for songwriting credit.
The cash register would later be found dead of an opioids overdose in Beverly Hills. I was actually having a hard time placing that sound on Yellow Submarine. I think they used it to sound like some kind of like machine mechanism when they were doing like the down periscope section of the song. But since Paul had conceived Yellow Submarine as a sing-along, they decided to invite some friends into the studio to join in on the chorus. And the party atmosphere, it's not unlike the chorus to Bob Dylan's Rainy Day Women number 12 and 35. You know, Everybody Must Get Stoned, that song, which was in the charts at the time. According to Jeff Emmerich, Mick Jagger was at the party, but I've had trouble confirming this. It's not on the liner notes to the box set. But Mick's girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull, appeared to be there, as was fellow Rolling Stone Brian Jones, George's wife, Pattie Boyd, the Beatles driver, Alf Bicknell, and the two roadies, Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, we mentioned earlier. And everyone was predictably stoned, and the engineers gave everyone handheld microphones on long cords so they could just march around the studio as they liked, which I really love. Emmerich wrote in his memoir, the whole marijuana-influenced scene that evening was completely zany, straight out of a Marx Brothers movie. They raided the sound effects cupboard and pulled out everything they had. People grabbed gongs and bells and whatever they could take and just went nuts. George Martin directed the band through all these old radio drama style tricks to create sea sounds. He had John blowing bubbles into water using a straw, and George Harrison swirled water in a metal bathtub, and Brian Jones clinked glasses and I guess played an ocarina.
Water in a Straw, friend of the pod, making its second appearance on the podcast after starring in the Monster Mash.
Oh my God, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess John and Paul shouted into tin cans to get that muffled, talking through the ships too. Yeah. And you can hear Pattie Boyd shrieking during the "and our friends were all aboard" part. There were coins scattered. There's the sound of a propeller in the water. Chains rattled around. Glasses clinked. And a marching drum banged. And John ran into the echo chamber of Studio 2 and ad-libbed the whole "full speed ahead, Mr. Boatswain" bit. John had this dream of singing underwater. He really thought that would be a great effect for the song. And he tried to gargle, but this caused him to choke. And George Martin talked him out of diving into a water tank to sing out of that. He was not very technical. Engineer Jeff Emmerich, who was barely 20 and just weeks into this job, attempted to fulfill John's dream of singing underwater by wrapping a microphone in a condom and dropping it in a quart milk jug, nearly electrocuting John in the process. The microphone was phantom powered, which means that it had electricity going through it. And if it had gotten wet, it would have been really bad. Sadly, well, I guess not sadly, he didn't get electrocuted that day, but the experiment failed. But all's well that ends well. No one was electrocuted, and the evening ended with Mal Evans banging a marching band bass drum strapped to his chest and leading the Beatles' entourage in a conga line all through the studio until they wandered out high as kites at 2:30 in the morning. How fun do you think that was? Think about that next time you listen to Yellow Submarine.
Yeah, that's really the high point of Western civilization, is all of them just being baked out of their gourds, staggering out of Abbey Road in a conga line led by a roadie with a bass drum on his chest.
I mean, the best part of all this is that it was noted by musicologist Walter Everett that Yellow Submarine was recorded in twice the length that it took the Beatles to record their debut album.
Tremendous.
The original version of Yellow Submarine originally had a 30-second spoken word intro at the beginning that John had written in his idiosyncratic Lewis Carroll-like poetic style. And it had nothing to do with the Yellow Submarine plot, but it sounded almost like a medieval prologue, and it was loosely based on a charity walk that someone had taken between the two furthest points in England.
And we will march till 3 the day to see them gathered there. From Landergroats to John Green, with Stepney do we tread. To see us yellow submarine, we love it.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And to complete,
Maybe
the
should have
effect,
kept that one on the send that back for another rewrite there, John.
They cut it, but yeah, this intro was funny. They did the old radio trick of putting pieces of coal in a box and shaking it to sound like a bunch of footsteps marching. But yeah, it was ultimately cut, and it didn't surface until it was the B-side of the CD single for Real Love during the Anthology Project in 1996. But I don't think it was really widely available until this new Revolver box set. The song Yellow Submarine itself drew some unsavory rumors. As author Steve Turner explains in his book A Hard Day's Right, the rumor quickly spread that Yellow Submarine was a veiled reference to drugs. In New York, Nembutal capsules started to be known as Yellow Submarines, but Paul denied the allegations. The song was also adopted by radical groups in the 60s for various protest chants. Striking workers in the UK would march to "We All Live on Bread and Margarine." That's pretty funny. And anti-Vietnam War protesters chanted, "We're all dropping jellied gasoline." That's good. Get a napalm reference in there. Time magazine referred to the song Yellow Submarine at the time as, quote, "a symbol of the psychedelic set's desire for escape." And friend of the Beatles and also friend of the pod, Donovan, suggested that Yellow Submarine represented the Beatles' state as prisoners of their fame.
Well, with all that, now we arrive to She Said, She Said. A song, the genesis of which can be traced to August 24th, 1965. The Beatles were in the midst of their second U.S. tour and had a few days off, so they holed up in their rented home in L.A., from which they had gotten from Zsa Zsa Gabor. Enemy of the pod, Zsa Zsa Gabor?
Oh, she's a friend of the pod.
Oh, friend of the pod, Zsa Zsa Gabor. Unfortunately, this address had been announced on LA area radio stations.
That's a major screw up.
Yeah, and some especially enterprising girls hired a helicopter for $50 an hour to fly over the home, which was itself built into the side of a hill and surrounded by a moat with only a drawbridge to grant access to it. Supposedly why it was chosen for its security fortifications. This caper was all apparently inspired by an I Love Lucy episode.
Friend of the pod, I Love Lucy.
According to a version of this story told by the band's driver, one of these girls leapt from the chopper into this swimming pool, which this seems smacks of exaggeration, although one of them did attempt to do this and had to be pulled back inside by the pilot, who presumably saw his life flash before his eyes watching a teeny
girl
bopper die as he was buzzing the most famous band in the world's house with his helicopter. They just yelled from the helicopter things at the Beatles.
Nice things.
The Beatles were, however, reportedly more impressed than they were annoyed, but manager Brian Epstein complained to the LAPD, and a no-fly zone was ordered around the area. But these girls became semi-celebrities thanks to their antics, and were invited to meet the Beatles a few days later. George Harrison greeted them by saying something to the effect of, "Is your father rich or something?"
I mean, a legitimate question for some teen girls who just hired a helicopter.
Yes. But a more fun leisure time for the group had been to take LSD together as a band. John and George had famously been dosed by their dentist at a dinner party a few months earlier in March, which was must have been a horrifying experience considering they hadn't expected it whatsoever. This was a favorite pastime of the Grateful Dead, was dosing the shit out of people with ungodly pure acid when they were
Owsley acid.
The ne plus ultra of acid. You'd just be hanging out with the Grateful Dead, and all of a sudden the walls would start to melt. So they decided to do it as a band. In the Beatles anthology, George says, "John and I decided that Paul and Ringo had to have acid because we couldn't relate to them anymore." Oh, not just on the one level, we couldn't relate to them on any level because acid had changed us so much. It was such a mammoth experience that it was unexplainable. It was something that had to be experienced because you could spend the rest of your life trying to explain what it made you feel and think. It was all too important to John and me. So the plan was that when we got to Hollywood, on our day off, we were going to get them and take acid. We got some in New York. It was on sugar cubes wrapped in tinfoil, and we'd been carrying these around all through the tour until we got to L.A. Ringo was down, famously saying, "I'll take anything." I was swimming in jelly in the pool. It was a fabulous day. The night wasn't so great because it felt like it was never going to wear off. Ringo, with his characteristic ability to describe anything hilariously. Paul was less down, and they were slightly cruel to him about it. Good. To which I say good. They should have bullied him for that. They were visited on this day by Roger McGuinn and David Crosby of the Byrds, who joined them on this trip, and this is apparently when they turned George onto Ravi Shankar for the first time. Or so they would say. So this trip turned out well for George, but things got bad when he started to go off on what the heads would call a bummer trip. And for some reason, Peter Fonda, enemy of the pod, Peter Fonda, was there to visit. An experienced day tripper, if there ever was one. Presumably it made a sort of sense to have Peter Fonda there, but he quickly harshed the vibes in the parlance of our times. George became convinced that he was dying, which is one of those common things that can happen to you when you're on any high degree of psychedelics. And Peter Fonda attempted to comfort him by saying, "Dying wasn't that bad." Quote, "I said I knew what it was like to be dead because when I was 10 years old, I'd accidentally shot myself in my stomach and my heart stopped beating 3 times while I was on the operating table because I'd lost so much blood. John was passing at the time and heard me saying, 'I know what it's like to be dead.' He looked at me and said, 'You're making me feel like I've never been born. Who put all that in your head?'" Sure. John tells a different version. Peter Fonda came in when we were on acid. He kept coming up to me and sitting next to me and whispering, "I know what it's like to be dead." That sounds more accurate.
Yeah.
That's the kind of bummer Peter Fonda would pull at a party. Quote, "He was describing an acid trip he'd been on. We didn't want to hear about that. We were on an acid trip and the sun was shining and the girls were dancing. You think it was Playboy models who
No,
were there?"
he said that. He's clarifying.
That they were, okay, well, that does sound like a great acid trip. And the whole thing was really beautiful and 60s. And this guy, who I didn't really know because he hadn't made Easy Ride or anything, kept coming over wearing shades and saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." And we kept leaving him because he was so boring. It was scary when you're flying high. Don't tell me about it. I don't want to know what it's like to be dead. George later said that Fonda was showing off his bullet hole and saying he was very uncool.
Imagine
God.
being called uncool by two of the right two Beatles.
Oh, man. Peter Fonda, the ultimate bummer.
World-class bummer.
Honestly, out of anyone from that whole scene, I don't think I would have wanted to drop acid with any of those people. Dennis Hopper would have made it weird.
Nicholson?
No, Jack Nicholson would have made it extremely weird.
Who, if
None of
anyone
them.
in that scene, who would you like to have dropped? Probably Mama Cass.
Paul Newman.
Oh, did he? Who am I thinking of? Oh, Robert Mitchum, I think.
Paul Newman probably just would have been drunk through the whole thing.
Yeah.
He would have just been cracking beers and making salads. That would have been a hell of a time. Yeah, dude. Give me dropping acid with Paul Newman in like sunny California, 1967. You're just eating salad, drinking Budweisers. Maybe you ride motorcycles.
Oh, yeah.
Take me back. Put that. If I'm ever in the Matrix, put me into that. I'm making a deal with Agent Smith. Give me just a sunny afternoon in Northern California with Paul Newman on acid. Ah. I have a new happy place to go to. It's me and Paul Newman crushing buds and drinking and eating salads. driving around in his car.
The salads loom large in this. Is it because of his salad dressing? Or
Oh,
is it
Paul
just...
Newman was a notorious salad enthusiast. One of the only interviews that he gave in like his self-imposed blackout was to this food writer in the 90s, and he gives her his hamburger recipe. He gives her his he gave, I guess, in a Playboy interview from 1968 that I've been able to bring the text to for, but he gave them his recipe for salad, his favorite salad. Yeah, he actually did love salads, and he loved beer too. I mean, I guess
that I know.
his drinking habit got so bad, that John Woodward almost kicked him out, and his compromise was that he would no longer drink liquor. But I think Ethan Hawke said he would still drink a case of beer through dinner.
Through dinner.
Yeah.
I didn't know that he was in the like Richard Harris, Richard Burton, Oliver Reed
dude.
level.
Bud and salads and race cars.
Well, race cars, yeah.
The greatest American man. Fucking Paul Newman.
I love
fuck
watching...
Peter Fonda wishes. Ugh, we're getting off track. We got 17. We got
that's right.
100 hours more of Revolver to get through.
So anyway, the Peter Fonda incident, we'll hereinafter be known as the Peter Fonda incident, is where the opening lines to She Said, She Said came from. Originally, it was He Said, He Said. I know what it's like to be dead for obvious reasons, but it was ultimately changed. In an early home demo version, John can be heard singing, "It's making me feel like my trousers are torn," instead of making me feel like I've never been born. There are tons of home versions of this song, and it's clear that he was stuck on it for a long time. Because he always gets to the same point in all these demos and then kind of stops. Hence why it didn't make it on the Rubber Soul, which was the next album they recorded after the aforementioned Peter Fonda incident. George Harrison claimed that he actually helped John finish She Said, She Said by basically acting as an editor. He said, "I was at his house one day. This was in the mid-'60s, and he was struggling with some tunes. He had loads of bits, maybe 3 songs that were unfinished, and I made suggestions and helped him work them together so they became one finished song, She Said, She Said. The middle part of that record is a different song. She said, 'I know what it's like to be dead,' and I said, 'No, no, no, you're wrong.' Then it goes into another one, 'When I was a boy.' That was a real weld. So I did things like that." And there's a chance that it was finished up on the fly because, according to Jeff Emmerich, it occurred to everyone basically at the 11th hour that they were short a song for the album. Emmerich wrote in his memoir, "It wasn't until the very end, when most of Revolver was mixed and ready to be mastered, that someone realized that the album was a song short. I guess traditionally they were supposed to have 14 tracks. And if they were too short, there would be complaints, or worse yet, returns from consumers. Not only was there a release date set and a hungry public clamoring to hear the finished album, but the Beatles were booked to begin a European tour just days after the sessions ended, so there was no time to spare." It's hilarious to me that even the biggest band in the world would think, oh no, 13 songs, not enough. We got to give them a full... They really cared about value for money. There's the famous sort of Beatle edict where they never wanted to release songs that were off their album as singles. They always wanted to have specific dedicated singles and a specific album because they wanted to, I mean, the stated reasons, they wanted to give the public value for money. Anyway, so on the next to last day of the sessions on June 21st, 2 days before they were due to leave on their tour, imagine 2 days before, they banged out She Said, She Said in a single day, the only song on Revolver to be done that quick. However, and I mean this in the nicest way, She Said, She Said kind of sounds like it was bashed out in a hurry, kind of in a good way. It's like a garage rock track.
Yeah.
At the start of the recording sessions, it was still untitled, so it was very much a rushed job. The session went from 7 o'clock at night to 3:45 the following morning. And this is kind of Beatle time by this point. The sessions would start later and later in the day, and this is kind of in the era when they would just start to work all night. They spent much of the session rehearsing the song with at least 25 attempts before finally making their first proper attempt at recording it. And they taped the rhythm track in 3 takes, but nerves are apparently a little frayed after all these rehearsals because at one point, Paul McCartney says that he walked out of the studio following an argument. And he told his friend and biographer Barry Miles, "I'm not sure, but I think this was one of the only Beatle records I never played on. I think we had a Barney, and I said, 'Oh, F you.' And they said, 'Well, we'll do it.' And I think George played bass." And this is interesting to me because it's something of a mystery. There's nothing noted in the EMI Studios records, but listeners have observed that the bass playing on She Said, it's a little more simple than the type of stuff Paul was doing in this era. However, Mark Lewison, the Beatles historian supremo who heard all of the session tapes, wrote in his book, The Beatles Recording Sessions, that he heard bass, drums, and 2 guitars on the live rhythm track. So maybe Paul's misremembering it, or maybe he left after the rhythm track was recorded, but before the vocals were added. It's unclear, but interestingly, during the Get Back documentary, in the scene after George has left and John and Paul kind of have a tete-a-tete in the cafeteria for a private conversation, and Michael Lindsay Hogg bugs the flower pot so that he can pick up on what they're saying, which is definitely a violation of journalist ethics.
Something.
Yeah. John and Paul mention She Said as a point of contention in the past. So clearly something went down during the recording of this song. But who knows?
Wow.
And now, Heigl, I'm about to storm out of this episode. We have reached the end of side 1, so please excuse us while we take a very short break to get up and flip the record. Unfortunately, it's an exceptionally heavy record, and it will take us several days to turn it. We'll be back in 2 days for the second installment of our tribute to Revolver that examines side 2, as well as the title and artwork for this truly amazing album. In the meantime, we urge you to check out the new deluxe reissue wherever you listen to your favorite music. And hey, why not check out my piece on people.com, The Magic Circle, Why the Beatles Revolver is a Monument to the Collaborative Spirit. Just Google Revolver and people.com. You'll find it.
It's a great piece. I read it.
Thank you, Heigl. You edited it. Yeah, Heigl always makes everything better. Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody.
Everyone get home safe. Don't let Peter Fonda bum you out. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you literally on the flip side.
End of part 1. Intermission.
Too Much Information was a production of iHeartRadio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The supervising producer is Mike Johns.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl.
With original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.